So I start off every live edge project the same, and that's making the slabs nice and flat using my router sled. I have a more in-depth video of the router sled that I use, which I'll tag below. Because the slabs had a slight twist to them, I shimmed each end to make sure there was no more rocking. Using a 1.5 inch surfacing bit in my router, I began to take off 1/8 of an inch at a time until both sides of the slabs were completely flat. I'll put a link to the router bit that I use below. Now it's time to build the form. For this, I'm using 5/8 of an inch thick plywood. The size of the form really depends on the dimensions of the size of the table you're making. In this case, I made a 6 foot by 3 foot table. I cut the base of the form a couple inches bigger than the final size of the table. That way you can cut out any deficiencies that might happen during the epoxy stage. With the offcut of the ply, I cut those into 4 4-inch strips, and then I cut 2 of those strips the same length as the base. I then cut 2 more for the ends, allowing the thickness of the plywood either side. Once all the pieces were cut, I covered them all completely in construction tape. The reason for the construction tape is so that the epoxy doesn't stick to the plywood during the curing stages. Once the epoxy is cured, you should be able to peel your plywood away from the table without causing any damage. I attach the sides to the form using a bead of silicone and countersinking screws. Ensuring the bottom of the form is flat and flush with the underside of the 4-inch strip. I repeat this process on both sides. I then attach the ends of the forms using the same technique. Again, ensuring that the underside of the form is flat and flush with the 4-inch strip. Once all 4 sides are attached to the form, and then apply a small bead of silicone around the whole perimeter of the form. I then clean up any excess. I then flip the form over and then tape all the seams. This may seem unnecessary, but epoxy is so expensive, so I want to make sure that nothing gets out. While the silicone's drying on the form, I begin to cut my slabs to size, making sure they're about a 1/16 smaller than the inside of the form, so then they slip in nicely. Once that was done, I then cleaned up all the live edge and all the cracks and the holes using a wire brush attachment in my drill. You want to remove as much of the loose bark as possible, this way you enhance the bond between the wood and the epoxy. I then removed all the marks left behind from the router sled, using an 80 grit sandpaper in my sander. I then flipped the slabs upside down and then taped all the cracks and holes that go all the way through. This helps the risk of wasting epoxy. I then put the slabs into the form. You can see here that I put a bead of silicone around the pour and the cracks and the holes. This basically creates a little dam for the epoxy so it can contain itself and it doesn't just spread and pour out everywhere. Now it's time to calculate the amount of epoxy that is needed. I begin by making a mark roughly every 8 inches. At each mark made, I measure the distance of the void or the river section, whichever you want to call it. I then add those measurements up and then divide that number by the amount of measurements taken. I then times that number by the thickness of the slabs. I then multiply that total by the overall length of the pour. I then divide that number by 61. This will give you a close enough estimate of how much epoxy you need. I also added a couple of liters because you see all the amount of holes and cracks I have in this table. But that might not be necessary on your project. If my calculations were correct, I needed a whole 28 liters of epoxy. For this application, I used Epoxy liquid plastic 2:1 mix ratio. I mixed the epoxy for about 15 minutes on the low setting of my drill, and then I let it sit for about half an hour to let the air bubbles escape. What a rush! Anyway, I let this sit for about 2 hours after I've poured. This allows all the air bubbles to rise to the top, and then come back with a blowtorch to pop all those bubbles. This isn't completely necessary because the epoxy takes 72 hours to cure, which allows the air bubbles to pop on their own, but it's just so fun, so I just do it anyway. "72 hours later, once the epoxy is fully cured, I then took all the high spots off using my router sled. I then begin the rough sanding. Starting from 80 grit, I work my way up to 120 grit. Between each grit, I give the table a dust down and then a wipe over with a mixture of mineral spirits and water. This will help remove any of the swirls left behind from the sander and then clean up any of the dust left behind from the epoxy. I then cut the table down to this final size using my track saw. I'm so sorry. It's the only way I can think of to make sanding look more interesting. I continue the sanding process using all the grits all the way up to 320 grit, using the same techniques as before. I then give the table a final dust off ready for finish. I began the finishing process by giving the tabletop a base coat of Osmo oil wood wax extra thin. I applied this using a blue shop towel and then I let it sit to dry overnight. I gave it a dust off in between coats. I then applied 2 layers of Osmo Oil Poly X, allowing 8 hours to dry in between. I applied the first coat of Poly X using my polisher and a white pad. And then before I did the final coat, I attached the base to the top. Ensuring the base is fully centered to the tabletop, I attached it using threaded inserts. As I went along, I glued in every threaded insert using 5-minute epoxy. Once the top was attached to the base, I gave it one final coat of Osmo Poly X oil. I applied the final coat thinly using a blue rag. And there you have it, easy. I'm so happy how this table turned out. I love how dark the epoxy is, yet it's still kind of translucent. It just gives it that kind of classy feel. So as always, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. I would appreciate that so much. If If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to let me know down below. If you want to go see some more of my day-to-day stuff, go follow me at RadDadBuilds on Instagram. And yeah, as always, stay rad. Peace.